Ladies and gentlemen, if anybody in the room is not currently reading David Stockman, you should be. Of course, as some of you probably remember, he was director of OMB under Reagan. He was a congressman prior to that. But far more importantly, from my perspective anyway, is that he wrote what I think is one of the most important financial books ever written, and certainly the most important financial book of the 21st century, called The Great Deformation, which not only explains the crash of 2008, but also explains so much about central banking and how it finances all kinds of evil in the decades prior. He has a new book out called Trumped, which somebody needs to get to Trump and have him read it ASAP, because I'm afraid without that, we are going to be lost in some kind of a cataclysm of spending. But David Stockman runs a website called Contra Corner. He is an absolute tireless writer against crony capitalism, and I think he's one of the leading lights in our movement today. Thanks so much, David Stockman.
Well, thank you very much for that warm welcome. It's the first time anybody's applauded since way back in 1985 when they ran me out of Washington on a rail in the Reagan administration. But I really want to give my sincere appreciation to Jeff for saying a good thing about my book, The Great Deformation. Because when it came out in 2013, it was denounced by every point on the political compass, the Republicans and the Democrats and the liberals and the conservatives, and Wall Street hated it, and the military-industrial complex found it offensive, and it got denounced wildly, loudly by the neocons in the Congress, and the social cons, and the tax cons, and the just cons, which is about everybody else left there. But I expected it to some degree, because I said, you know, the book is saying we're heading to a terrible dystopia where the Fed is destroying capitalism, where Imperial Washington is wrecking the world with all its interventions, where we're going bankrupt because of this government that can't stop spending and borrowing. So I expected some blowback, let's call it. But, you know, I thought at one point, one of the critics went way over the top, and that was your friend, Professor Paul Krugman, who, the day the book came out, wrote a blog called The Rantings of a Cranky Old Man. And that was what he had to say about my book. But, you know, that was going so far that it even aroused my 88-year-old mother, who, upon reading his blog, shot me an email saying, "Doesn't he know? You were a cranky young man, too." And the point is that I think there are a lot of cranky people in America who responded to what I had to say, because within one day after that cranky old man blog, my book, and I'm not bragging here, went to number 4 on the Amazon bestseller list. And the only thing ahead of it was 2 diet books and something novel, a horror novel called The Walking Dead. So I thought, well, maybe there is an audience out there. But the true point of the matter is that it did end up number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list. And again, I'm not bragging, because after 3 years, they're still debating at the New York Times whether that was number 3 on the fiction or the nonfiction category. But in any event, I'm very happy to be here, to be part of this conference on war and peace. I think we're on the war part today, at least as a result of the events of the last couple of days. But I do want to give just a quick update, Jeff, on your point about the general getting all hot and bothered about the Tomahawks. Here's the news flash on the Tomahawks. They fired 59. 36 of them were duds that landed in the desert somewhere. 23 hit the airfields. None of them hit the runway. They're launching sorties today from the runway that we didn't hit. Not a single operable plane was taken out. What they did hit was 3 Butler buildings, otherwise known as hangars, and a graveyard for inoperable planes that have been sitting there for the last who knows how long. So the point is, this was kind of a random, crazy thing. Where did it come from? 2 days, no investigation possible, plenty of circumstantial reasons to think that this was a false flag, very much like what happened back in August 2013. Everybody's forgot about that, the Goda event, so-called. but when you go back and look at what some of the objective evidence is, investigations today, it's pretty clear that it wasn't launched by the regime. It was launched by local jihadist radicals who are trying to bait Obama into doing exactly what Trump did 2 days ago when he had foolishly put out that red line. I also want to, before we get into the main topic, want to welcome everyone. I was delighted to hear that there are people here from Mexico and Canada. And hopefully you'll come back next year, even if you have to leap the wall when the thing actually gets built. Jeff had a very good observation about the think tanks, which just have proliferated everywhere in Washington, and I'm going to talk about that. They all say the same thing. I turned on cable news Thursday night, and you couldn't find anything from MSNBC to CNN to Fox that said anything different. There are all these generals, all these consultants, all these think tank experts, all these National Security Council types, all saying the same thing. They were in war heat. And so it reminds me today, Jeff, that really you don't have a whole bunch of think tanks around Washington. You have a whole bunch of group think tanks. They all think the same thing because they're all paid by the same paymaster, which I call the warfare state. In a moment, we'll get into some of the detail, but it's a $1 trillion monster that basically feeds the prosperity of the Beltway. That's why I call it the Imperial City. And everything in the Imperial City today is compromised, but most especially the news media. I was just struck, to tell you the truth. I was appalled when I heard the great guru. In the pecking order of things, there are some people that are felt to be the real thoughtful leaders of the media today. One of them is Fareed Zakaria. And when I heard him say on CNN Thursday night, as they were showing in the background all the flashing from the bombs hitting and so forth, that tonight Donald Trump became president because he was foolish and rash enough to launch an unconstitutional, illegal, unnecessary, pointless attack on an airfield in Syria, it sort of brought it all together and told me really what we're up against and why things like what Ron Paul is doing and what Mises is doing is so critically important, because there is a totally different view on what's going on in the world if you get your lens right, and if you're not part of this overwhelming groupthink consensus that is literally suffocating the machinery of government, the machinery of the mainstream media in Washington today. And that's why we're at this point, I think, that we're at. I also wanted, before I get into a little more substance, I want to acknowledge how much I admire and how grateful I am for all the work in behalf of the cause of peace. And that's really what it is that Ron Paul has done over so many decades. I consider him really a national treasure, a person that I've admired for the last 40 years since we both sat together in the Congress in 1978. And the interesting thing about that is that we were both kind of free market, rabid free market types, and we sat way in the back benches, and we were being totally ignored by everyone because they thought that what we were, focused on entirely was the free market. But actually, we were working on an issue that is the issue of the day. Ron was really, at that point, a closet peacenik, and little did they understand that I was a 30-year-old congressman at the time, and 10 years earlier, I'd been out on the barricades as a member of SDS protesting the war in Vietnam and really trying to disrupt the machine, and we've been going in the wrong direction ever since. And here we are today, and I'm more convinced than ever that what we were saying about the aggressive, expansionist, interventionist foreign policy then in 1968 that led to the folly of Vietnam, is even more true today. And that's why history, I think, is so important perspective. A lot of you probably travel. If you've ever been to Vietnam, you have to go to Hanoi if you're traveling to Southeast Asia, or go to Saigon and ask yourself, what in the hell were we doing putting 500,000 young Americans, billions of dollars, dropping on the country from one end to the other, napalm and every other kind of horrible thing out of the sky? Why were we doing that back in 1960s? What was the point? There is no trace of anything accomplished, any purpose, any valid objective for 50 years later. In fact, Vietnam is now becoming a major supplier of goods and services to the United States. So I just think that maybe we need to have a little perspective, historical perspective, and I have to say that in light of the event 2 days ago, I had to change the title of my speech. It originally was The Deep State and the Donald. And the whole idea was that in some ways he was a victim already of the deep state. They were trying to relitigate the election. That's what all of this Russiagate hysteria is about. And I thought, they're not going to win even if they wound and undermine him badly and even destroy his presidency, because at least he's an impetuous bomb thrower that would help to begin to, what the word I used was discredit and unmask this huge surveillance state that has grown up in the hysteria after 9/11. Well, little did I know that suddenly Donald Trump has been taken hostage by the deep state. And before we knew it, he's ending up being the tool of the deep state. And that's really the topic that I want to address today. How did this happen? How did it happen so fast that in a few days that a president that they were literally after attempting to drive from the very Oval Office, how did it end up that he did undertook the act that was so rash, so uncalled for? Even after, by the way, everybody's familiar with all the tweets that he put out in 2013 when Obama was on the brink after the false flag attack in August. You read all of them. Don't do it. How can you get involved in a civil war when there are two sides and you want to fight both of them? It's none of our business. They haven't attacked us. There is no possible danger. The only thing you could do is compound and exacerbate the most complex sectarian battle, conflict, civil war that we've ever seen. So he was right then. He was right last week when he sent his Secretary of State out to say, regime change is done. That was one of the fundamental propositions of his campaign. Regime change doesn't work. That's not our role, obviously. And so here we are in 3 days. The regime change is behind, thrown overboard. He had his neocon, ambassador to the UN saying the same thing. And since Nikki Haley basically reads out of the playbook that Samantha Powers left behind from the Obama administration, I'm sure it was tough for her to get out the words that we've decided not to take Assad out. But now here we are, and everything has changed, and he's back in the groove. So the question that I asked to myself was, well, what is the purpose of this attack after 2 days, no investigation of what really happened in Idlib province, in that little town where obviously it looks like they hit a ammo dump, and there could have well been, and there's plenty of suggestions that there were both regular ammunition and chemical weapons being stored there. But what was he possibly trying to accomplish if it's not regime change, if it's not taking out the entire Air Force and Army of the Syrians? What is he trying to accomplish? And the only thing that I can think of is that, and they've said it, Assad had to be punished. And so, the question comes to your mind, who appointed Donald Trump to be the global spanker-in-chief for any dictator or leader of a country that misbehaves? And that is not a basis for a foreign policy. That's not a valid basis for attacking any country. And if you want to be spanker-in-chief, why don't you take a look at the leader of Egypt, who was in the Oval Office a week or two ago? He's murdered thousands of his political opponents since he illegally took power in a coup several years ago. If you want to be spanker-in-chief and compel behavior, and this is the thing that Fareed Zakaria was saying, finally, the president has realized that there are standards in the world, and it's the job of the United States to enforce those standards, and if occasionally we have to use military power, let's do it. He was applauding that. Well, then where are the standards in this horrendous civil war that's going on in Yemen? We are arming the Saudis with every kind of destructive device, bomb, missile, drone that there is. They wouldn't have the firepower that they do without all this U.S.-supplied munitions. So far, 10,000 civilians have been casualties, 4,000 killed, men, women, and children, weddings, and all the rest of it, 6,000 injured. Many of them from cluster bombs, which are supplied by Textron to the Saudi government that is using it on the civilian population of Yemen. So if you want to be the spanker-in-chief, bring in the king of Saudi Arabia and, give him a whack or two. The point is, it makes no sense. There's no justification for it. And yet, that's about the only thing that I can think of that Donald Trump may be up to. So the question that I want to kind of try to answer a little bit is, how in 77 days did this outlaw, renegade, guy who said a few things in the campaign that made sense, like, let's make a deal with Putin. We don't have to have a war with Putin. Let's get out of the Middle East. Regime change has been a disaster. We've got rubble and destroyed states and millions of refugees and blowback of every time, everywhere. He said all this. How in 77 days is he doing something as stupid, as immoral, as short-sighted, as impulsive as starting a major conflict with the Assad government and getting exactly into harm's way with Russia and all of its allies that are on the ground there, the Iranians, Hezbollah, and all the rest of them? How did this happen in 77 days? And I think what I would like to do is suggest that the deep state, or the warfare state, or whatever you want to call it, has gotten so massive, the military, industrial, congressional, surveillance complex, and so forth, that it envelops everything that enters the imperial city, that enters the White House, the Oval Office, and therefore the kind of challenge and problem and threat, really, that we face from this thing is far greater than almost anybody could imagine if they could even take down Donald Trump within such a short period of time. Now, let's just say how big it is. I call it the trillion-dollar monster. And that's because if you take the $600 billion that's admitted to in the defense budget, you add about $50 billion for security assistance and foreign aid and all the rest of it. You add another $70 billion that goes into homeland security and an extension of the warfare state at home. $180 billion for veterans, and after all, we're spending $180 billion on veterans because we've had all these wars since Vietnam, since the last 50 years, that have been pointless, and we've ended up with all of these young men and women who need medical care or compensation or pensions and so forth. None of that ever should have happened, so charge it to the warfare state. Add a little bit of carry cost for the debt, which is now $20 billion, and you got a $1 trillion monster with funds flowing in every direction. And especially in the Imperial City, you have a 75 billion complex for the 17 agencies of the intelligence community. Now, the difference between what I call the intelligence complex and the old-fashioned notion of the military-industrial is that at least the military-industrial complex was spread all over the world and spread all over the country. We had bases all over the country, defense contractors all over, 200,000 forces abroad that shouldn't be there, and so forth. But when you get to the intelligence community, it is concentrated, massed in the greater metropolitan area of D.C. I think there's 2 or 3 or 400,000 contractors or direct employees. If you take the 75 billion budget of the CIA, NASA, and all the rest of them, 50 billion of it goes to contracts. And so you have all these huge contracting companies that are paying people big salaries, not GS 16 or 18 salaries, but huge salaries. You create that entire mass concentration of people all needing a justification for a continuation of the flow of all this money. That's why when you go into Washington, I don't go to Washington that much anymore, Congressman, but when I do, compared to what I saw when I started there in 1970 or even when I left in 1985, the prosperity is amazing. And you say to yourself, where is all this prosperity, this glass and steel, and all these new hotels and restaurants and all of this fancy stuff coming from in a city that has no manufacturing, has no industry? Where does it come from? It's coming from the $75 billion intelligence complex that's sprawled all over the entire metro area. So part of that, obviously, is the group think tanks. Part of that is the media that's housed there. I mean, Wolf Blitzer, can you stand to listen to another night of Wolf Blitzer drooling over, the next occupation or intervention or stage of the war? They're all down there embedded in that horrible environment that's been created. Now, my point is that if there were some kind of existential threat to the very future of our society, of our democracy, of our system, some horrible, immense, powerful, terminal threat to our existence, maybe that would be a justification for what we have. But I want to spend a couple minutes telling you that the real secret, and we need to get it out and sort of preach the gospel, is we have no serious industrial, technological, military threat anywhere on the planet. Instead of an existential threat, we have less of a threat than we've had since 1917 when Wilson foolishly put us into the First World War. And let's just tick off what is out there. The first one, obviously, is Russia. And that's a joke. If they're going to land on the shores of New Jersey, they would need vast power projection capability, aircraft carriers and suites of capacity to land. I know I'm being facetious, but the point is none of that is remotely possible because they've got one 50-year-old aging, smoke-belching aircraft carrier that's on duty in the Eastern Mediterranean and probably couldn't get out of the Straits of Gibraltar if it had to. That's it. So how do they threaten the security or the safety of anybody in America unless you think Putin, who is the ultimate chess player, the cool hand Luke of the global scene today, is foolish enough to risk nuclear retaliation by attacking us first and have all of Russia turned into a parking lot. The point is, we have had the nuclear deterrent on our submarine, Trident submarines, more than enough ever since I was there fighting the defense buildup in 1980. We don't need any more money. There's nothing that the Russians are going to do that remotely threatens us. And as a matter of fact, just to give you some feel for how silly this whole damn thing is, I actually am fortunate enough to live in New York City and on the 19th floor of a very nice apartment building on the East River. And when I look out from my balcony, I can see the Queens on the other side, and I look south and I can see Brooklyn. I look north. On one side there's Harlem, and on another side there's the Bronx. And also I can see the entirety of Russia from the balcony of my apartment in New York City. Now, I'm not doing a Sarah Palin on you, okay? I'm not talking about the Siberian landmass. I'm talking about the fact that the GDP that I can see from my balcony of New York metro area is 1.6 trillion, and the GDP of Russia is 1.3 trillion. In other words, the entire economy of Russia is not even as big as New York City. It's 1/7 of the GDP of the United States. Russia is mainly a huge hydrocarbon field with a few nickel mines, 100 million acres of wheat, and an aging workforce that has a great fondness for vodka and other distractions. So the point is, there is nothing there that could ever generate a threat or the military capability to harm us. Now, China is the same thing. If you think about it, do you really worry at night that China is going to send some missiles or a fleet of aircraft over the Pacific in order to bomb 4,000 Walmarts in America? I mean, the point is their economy would collapse within 6 months if they didn't have this bloated global system of exports and trade. That's what the whole Red Ponzi is predicated upon. And if they want to build sandcastles in the South China Sea, more power to them. But they aren't a threat to us, and frankly, they're not a threat to any of their neighbors either, because they depend on a huge supply of raw materials coming up through the South China Sea into their ports, and all the intermediate products that come from all the nearby countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, and so forth. Now, my point today is, can't we learn a lesson from the demise of the Soviet Union in the 80s? One of the things I had to do over and over when I was in the budget office was fight this massive buildup of defense spending that Reagan got convinced to do, when the Soviet Union was dying on its own accord because it was predicated on a centralized socialist controlled economy that was falling apart. And the only thing we really needed to do was just wait it out, and sure enough, it did. It wasn't the Reagan buildup. It wasn't Star Wars. All the money that went into that Reagan buildup ended up, ironically, going into conventional weapons. It didn't go into strategic defense. It didn't go into strategic offense. It went into tanks, and it went into a 600-ship Navy and more aircraft carriers and more cruise missiles and Tomahawks and so forth. All the things that subsequently got used for the wars of invasion and occupation that we never should have undertaken. But my point is, let's learn from that mistake and realize that China is a red Ponzi of historic proportion, that 20 years ago, the debt of all of China was $500 billion. Today, it's $30 trillion. That you don't blow up the debt of a system by 60-fold, 60x, in 2 decades, and create a frenzy of building and speculating and borrowing and gambling, really, and expect the system to be stable, sustainable, when there are no market mechanisms to discipline it, or there's no honesty in the system, since they all lie up and down the channel. So my point is, we only need to wait it out. We don't have to get excited about the China threat either. And frankly, we don't have to get that excited about the terrorism threat either. And if we wanted to do something about it, that's the third item, we ought to stop bombing and droning and occupying, because it's the blowback from that that's created what does exist today as a terrorist threat. And I think all of you know that, because all you have to do is ask yourself, before 1990, how many terrorist incidents do you remember? Not many, and most of them had to do with intramurals between the Palestinians and the Israelis. It had nothing to do with us. It had nothing to do with Europe. And all of a sudden, allegedly, we're more in peril than ever before in history. Well, where did all this come from? It started with Gulf War I. What in the world were we doing trying to argue, resolve, or intervene in a fight between the Emir of Kuwait, who was directionally drilling into Saddam's oil field, and Saddam was pissed off, and pretty soon he decided to take over the oil field. And the next thing we knew, George Bush said, "This will not stand." We had 500,000 troops on the sands of Saudi Arabia. The Mujahideen that we had armed and trained to fight the Soviets became offended because we were defacing the Holy Lands, and the next thing we knew, we ended up where we are today. But the point is, stop the intervention. The blowback will die out. The threat will eventually disappear. But beyond that, they're not coming over here anyway. And I just have to get this point across. I had it in my book that I wrote on Trump. And that is, I got very upset during the campaign when he was talking about terrorists everywhere, lurking behind every bush. So I went and checked it out. And it turns out, if you take this time frame, which is 15 years, between 9/11 and that last unfortunate incident done by the lone wolves in San Bernardino, which I think was December 2015, in that period, 420 Americans were killed by lightning, okay? And 6 Americans, civilians, were killed by terrorist acts outside of military bases. So that gives you a little bit of perspective about the fact that 99.9% of the American people in the towns and cities and villages and farms of America are not imperiled by terrorists. And this huge, massive system that we've created to combat them is part of the problem, not part of the solution. And, so it leads to the system to keep itself alive leads to what I call endless false narratives, because if there isn't an enemy, if there isn't an imminent threat, if there isn't danger lurking everywhere, even if it's more from lightning than it is from terrorists, then over time it becomes hard to justify all of this money that is being wasted in this massive system. I want to mention one or two, because this is one of the things I do in my blog, and I think it's important that we educate people about what is taken for granted as truths in the day-to-day mainstream media, which is totally distorting of the facts and is creating a false case for this massive system that led Donald Trump to try to bomb an airfield, which even that didn't happen. One of them is Russia is an expansionist power, and if they can't get to the New Jersey shores, they're going to take over all of Europe. And how do we know that? Well, because allegedly they occupied Crimea. All right, now here are the facts on Crimea. Catherine the Great bought Crimea for hard gold money in 1783 from the Turks, who were desperate for cash. It was a stalwart part of Russia for 200 years. Sevastopol, the main port, became the home port for the Black Sea Fleet, the heart of the Russian Navy under czars and commissars alike. And it was not until 1956, after being in the heart of the Russian Empire. In fact, the charge of the Light Brigade occurred in Crimea, and it was the occupying invaders who were charging the English, and it was the Russian patriots who were defending the homeland. That's the point. But it wasn't until 1956, after the succession of Stalin was resolved and Khrushchev had killed off his two rivals. And Khrushchev, as you remember, was a Ukrainian, so in a night of drunken celebration with his comrades from Kiev and the Ukraine, they decided they would transfer in the Soviet Empire Crimea from Russia to the Ukraine. That's how it happens. So we're supposed to start a war today in order to compel Russia to return Crimea because of invasion that we helped, or a coup that we helped start in 2014. My point is, Crimea has been part of Russia and provided them with a warm water port for 173 years, which is longer than California has been part of the United States when we got our warm water port, in California. The point is there are a lot of these that we could talk about. One other that I just want to mention, and then I'll take some questions, is, we're constantly being told that they need these billions of dollars to do the policing on the homeland, all this homeland security stuff, because there are terrorist cells everywhere. But I think, Congressman, you've probably looked at this, but the fact is that about 90% of these so-called busts of terrorist cells are FBI stings. And one of my anyone who wants to get educated on the terrorist threat needs to only go back and watch Paul Newman and Robert Redford's movie of 40 years ago called The Sting, and you will see exactly what's going on today. But most of them are sting operations, and the latest one was, and I just mentioned this in closing, the latest one was in Kansas City, where the FBI agents cultivated for several weeks a young man who was so destitute, so out of it, such a loser, who his wife had left him and had a young son, that the FBI had to give him $30 and babysit his son while he went to Walmart to buy a list of stuff that they had given him, like copper wires and batteries and fertilizer and a few other incriminating things. Now, this may be an extreme case, but the point is this is part of what I call this false narrative that's constantly going on. So the bottom line, I guess, of my point today is that maybe there's a silver lining in this latest capture of Trump by the deep state, this utterly stupid attack on Syria. And that is maybe it will help revive a coalition, an anti-war coalition in the Congress, like the one that I started with way back in 1968, when both non-interventionists like Senator Aiken from Vermont and real doves from the Democrat side came together and basically put Johnson out of business, stopped the war, and ended the madness. Maybe now the liberals and the so-called progressives will come back to life. I mean, they've been essentially sidelined during the whole Obama era because anything he did they had to justify. But if we have an opportunity now to tell Trump that you can't do this without congressional authorization, and a real debate begins in Congress, which I think is beginning to happen, maybe we can revive some kind of resistance, some kind of opposition to the madness that's been going on. And in this setting, I want to particularly commend Rand Paul for the tremendous leadership, the astute and brilliant, representation of this position that he's doing.